Well, based on what they're describing, is it something ancient people really could have made? Is it realistically something an ancient person could have made rather than something that was made like by a modern person? And we talked about I don't think it's realistically something Joseph Smith could have forged. I don't think he had.
Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And in today's episode, this is part 2 of my interview with scholar and Book of Mormon researcher Neal Rappleye. Neal, thanks for joining me again.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Neal needed a week's break after our last episode that went about 3 hours. But go check out part 1. If you didn't watch it, we had a discussion about some of the strongest evidence in favor for the Book of Mormon. We talked about different things such as like the historical and like religious context in Jerusalem, 600 BC, how this sort of correlates and fits with First Nephi and Lehi and Nephi in Jerusalem. We talked a lot about Nahum and Bountiful and a lot of the work that Neal's done in that. We talked about ancient names in the Book of Mormon, Mesoamerica convergences, the geology in the Book of Mormon, and then we finished with the discussion on the witnesses of the gold plates, talking about the natural witnesses. The 8 witnesses are those people who held the plates covered in a cloth, and then we also looked at the 3 witnesses and sort of responding to some of the criticisms as well. And this episode, we're going to be focusing on a recent, well, the article's not been published yet, but a recent presentation that you did at Fair on ancient metal plates in the ancient world, and looking at the description and sort of like the dimension of the gold plates, and could the text of the Book of Mormon have fit on the gold plates? How many gold plates would there have been? And sort of like responding to some criticisms on the gold plate. So that's going to be the main focus of this discussion. But before we get into that, we were chatting before I hit record, Neal, that after our discussion on the witnesses, a statement or a source kind of came to my mind. It just kind of popped into my mind weirdly one day during the week. I have these random thoughts, whenever you research, or just random quotes of things which nobody else would care about popped into my mind. But it was the source where John Whitmer is being interviewed by Theodore Turley. And that's the one that critics point to, where he says, like, I saw and handled the plates and they were shown unto me by supernatural power. And we talked about in the last episode that critics would view the Stephen Burnett statement that none of the 8 witnesses really saw the plates, they're covered in a cloth. And then critics would look at that one, okay, John Whitmer saying I saw them by supernatural power. So he didn't naturally see them. He saw them in a very visionary, a very subjective second sight sort of way, supernaturally through the cloth. But it was interesting because at this point, John Whitmer was very disillusioned with the church and Joseph Smith. And Theodore Turley asked him, like, how can you sort of, if you saw and handled the plates, how can you, doubt, Joseph Smith? And he said, I'm just going to read exactly what he says so I don't misquote. He says, so when Turley next asked bluntly why Whitmer now doubted the work, the witness indicated his inability to translate the characters on the plates. I cannot read it, and I do not know whether it is true or not. And the point I made to you off air, that I think that's a very interesting thing for him to say. So he's saying that I saw and handled the plates, but then when he's asked, like, how can you doubt sort of the authenticity? He's like, well, I can't translate them. I don't know if they're authentic ancient characters or not. So he's not denying seeing and handling, but he's saying, like, well, I don't know if they're real characters or not. I can't translate them. And I feel like that would make sense if he saw them naturally, uncovered, if he saw and handled the plates, and there wasn't a supernatural element, that he might say, well, I don't know if they're real ancient characters or not. But if he saw them supernaturally or like in a visionary way, as critics want to imply through the cloth, it seems strange that he would say, yeah, I saw and handled them, but then question the authenticity of the characters. You almost feel like he would question if he really did see them, or if it was some subjective hallucination, or if he might have said, like, I handled them, but I don't think I really did see them. Do you know what I mean? Like, if it was supernatural viewing, it's strange that he would say, yeah, I saw and handled, but then question, did I really see, like, are they genuine characters? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I 100%, I think you're 100% right about that. This is a source, I think it actually complicates the supernatural versus natural dichotomy more than it helps the critics in their argument, in my opinion. Because yeah, 100%, he comes out, the very first thing he does, like, first of all, it's important to understand the context. Like, John Whitmer is out of the church at the time. He's actually hostile towards the church at the time.
That's right.
He's with a group of people. Ironically, there's 8. So there's 8 witnesses to this statement, I suppose. But he's with a group of hostile people who are trying to drive the Mormons out of Missouri, right? And Theodore Turley, most of the saints are already leaving, but Theodore Turley's been commissioned to stay behind to help like wrap up some of their business things, get land sold, things like that, finalize deals. I don't know the exact logistics there, details off the top of my head, but he was there to finish some of the church's business dealings, and that's why he was staying behind. And these people come in and they start hostilely questioning Theodore Turley, and all the pressure, all the peer pressure there is to deny that the church is true, right? And Theodore Turley's being asked, John Corrill is another person who left the church at this time and was writing an expose, and they're told, you better leave the church and make an expose just like John Corrill. And Theodore Turley turns it around on John Whitmer, and he basically says, well, what about you? You said you saw the plates, right?
Yeah.
You said you saw the plates. What do you say about that now? And John Whitmer, in this setting where everyone would want him to deny, he's there with his anti-Mormon friends, right? He says, no, I handled those plates. There were fine engravings on both sides. I handled them. He can't deny it. And then, he says something about, I saw them by supernatural power. Theodore Turley appears to be summarizing a little bit there. And so some scholars like Larry Morris has questioned whether that's actually a direct quote from John Whitmer or if it's Theodore Turley's summary of what he said. But
I think I mentioned in the last episode, I sort of theorized as a possible interpretation is there was a Myron Bond quote that him feeling supernatural almighty power is one of the scribes. So again, theoretically, it's possible there could have been a conflation. You had another view of that.
Yeah. But then, like you said, afterwards, Theodore Turley asks him again. He's like, oh, well, okay, then how is the Book of Mormon not true now or whatever? And he says what you already just quoted, right? Basically, well, I couldn't read the characters. I don't know what they said. Like, and to me, 100% that makes no sense if his experience was supernatural in some way.
Yeah.
Either that supernatural experience is going to be questioned completely. He's going to be like, well, I don't even know if I really saw them anymore because we were handed them and they were covered and we had this weird visionary experience. Or he's going to still have conviction of the visionary experience. And because it was a vision, he's going to have conviction of the divine provenance of the Book of Mormon itself, right?
Exactly, yeah.
It makes no sense for him to have had a divine sort of experience and still stick by that experience, but then be unsure about the provenance of the Book of Mormon. But that does make sense if he's just been shown a set of plates and he's like, yeah, I saw these plates and I looked at them, but how do I know the Book of Mormon came from that, right? Like,
yeah. And I felt like that statement, along with the vast majority of their first, secondhand statements, where they talk about seeing the plates, very naturally, I saw and I handled. This again just confirms to me that it wasn't visionary or supernatural viewing, or else that statement really wouldn't have made any sense.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you on that for sure.
Well, that's cool. That must have just been inspiration that came to me. I would brought that up whenever I talk with Dan Vogel, and I'd love to hear what a critic's response would be, because someone might say like, oh well, John Whitmer, he's doubting his testimony here. And that would be more concerning, say, if it was one of the 3 witnesses, but this corroborates him seeing it naturally. So I thought that was kind of cool. I think we've made the point So yeah, an interesting thought on the witnesses. So what we're going to talk about, we're going to talk about, the gold plates. We're going to talk about could the text of the Book of Mormon fit on the plates, Reformed Egyptian. But you've done a recent presentation on FAIR. So we're talking about ancient metal plate artifacts that have been found throughout the ancient world. And I think that's something which is quite cool as well, because I believe around the time of Joseph Smith, some people criticized just this whole idea, this notion of ancient writing on ancient metal plates. Was that viewed at the time of Joey Smith by many critics as like, this seems kind of anachronistic, this ancient people didn't write on metal plates?
Yeah, so it wasn't, the idea of writing on metal wasn't totally unknown, right, in 1830, and this has been, overstated by some people in the past who have said like, oh yeah, no one wrote on metal, no one believed that in 1830. It was a preposterous idea. So and people have gone back and done research. Mike Reed a number of years ago did a bunch of research showing, oh, there's like, if you have like Bible dictionaries and Bible commentaries from that time, a lot of them mention writing on metal plates. It's usually just kind of like in passing, they mention it. And so it's not totally unknown. I don't want to make it sound like that, but absolutely there were critics in the 19th century who criticized the idea of writing on metal plates. There was Leroy Sunderland criticized it in like 1838, I think, and there was another guy in 1857. And some people quibble. They're like, well, 1857, that's not within Joseph's lifetime. Well, Joseph died young, guys. Let's keep that in mind. He was murdered in 1844. But the average lifespan of a person in Joseph's day was such that 1857 would be well within his normal lifespan if he hadn't been cut short. And obviously, a lot of his contemporaries, Brigham Young, Wilford Woodruff, and stuff, they are still alive, right? So within the time period of the first generation of Latter-day Saints, there's absolutely criticisms coming out. And even by like 1880, M.T. Lamb makes a criticism of it. And this is a criticism that persisted for a long time. John Tvetnes told a story in his book, which was published in 2000, so like 23 years ago. He published this book on ancient records in general and the patterns that they have. And he talked about metal plates in a chapter. But he talked about like contemporary with him, so probably in like the 1990s or something, there were people criticizing the Book of Mormon for being written on plates. And even if people weren't always explicitly criticizing that idea, the very reaction, right, to this golden Bible, the way people reacted to it, and they clearly thought this was an absurd, a preposterous idea to have like an ancient record written on metal that's dug out of a hill, right? The whole thing just struck people as absurd and preposterous. So totally anachronistic to think that in 1830. Well, maybe not, but certainly a lot of people found the idea pretty ridiculous. And as far as actual tangible evidence for the practice goes, right, people may have thought it possible, but the evidence that it could be done certainly was not well known, right, or had even been discovered. There were people like, and we'll end up talking a lot about some examples from India here, but people knew about like ancient metal records from India in the early 1800s, but they didn't really know a lot about more widespread practices of writing on metal, or how ancient it really went back to, right? They didn't have the evidence that we do now to be able to contextualize this practice and understand it, and the data that actually shows, no, this is a thing that people did, and there's a variety of different ways and forms that people did it, and things like that. But it's, they didn't have the evidence then, which we do now. So yeah, there's some evidence people had some notion of it, but the evidence that people really knew about the practice and all the practices that go along with it, there really isn't a lot of data for that.
Right.
So
Okay,
Yeah.
and we're going to sort of follow your slides, and if people have watched the fair presentation, we'll probably be going over some of that that you covered in there. There'll probably be maybe some more discussions or the odd question for myself. And as you're talking about these different ancient metal plate artifacts that are be found, I think just talking about where it was found, sort of like the location, the century, and sort of like the rough maybe length or sort of like the nature of the text. Is it sort of a religious text or historical ritual, those sorts of things, if you're able to provide that, which will be helpful for me and I think my listeners to understand, what are these different ancient metal plate artifacts.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me just go ahead. Before I actually jump into my slides, I want to share, I know you talked to Ryan, who runs our Evidence Central project here at Scripture Central.
That's right.
I want to maybe just get a plug in here for the Records and Relics section of Evidence Central. I didn't exactly pilfer this. I did some of my own research, but I drew a lot from what Ryan and Matt Roper have put together here for the Records and Relics section of Evidence Central. And this is where you can go to get a lot of background on some of the examples I use and stuff. Things like doubled documents, which I can explain more, and John W. Welch has done a lot of research on evidence for gold books in the ancient world, and not just single gold plates and things like that, but actual books, right? Things that are bound together, multiple series of plates in a book format, in a codex format. Things like the plate dimensions. That actually I did write that one. That one was me, not mine, Matt or Ryan. But so I'll take credit for that. But most of this was Matt and Ryan. Lengthy plates, we'll talk about some of these, but there are several examples, particularly from India, of really long plates. Many plates, massive, extensive archives of metal plates. People sometimes have said that, like, oh, they don't really do the Book of Mormon's portrayal of like extensive record keeping on metal plates is ridiculous or unbelievable or whatever. But there are examples of this kind of thing in the ancient world. Plates and history. So some people have actually said you don't find historical narratives written on plates. People didn't write history on plates.
Yes.
No, we have, particularly again, a lot of this is going to be coming from India, which some might say isn't super relevant to the Book of Mormon or whatever, but I think you gotta look at the broad spectrum of evidence before you jump to conclusions, right? But there are people who wrote long historical narratives on plates. They wrote narratives about warfare on plates. They wrote rituals and genealogies and laws and prophecies on plates. All of these are genres that you find in the text of the Book of Mormon, of course. Priestly records. There's tons. We don't need to go over all of this, right? But I just wanted to get this plug in here. There's
And
tons of
I'll definitely
examples.
link this as well in the description, and because I've not read through a lot of those, and I think that would be a great resource for people as well to read through as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's just tons of examples of things that can be compared to the Book of Mormon in various ways. And like I said, I'll be pulling some of what I pull, given my presentation, was pulled from some of these. Some of it is original stuff that I added on top of that.
Right.
But
So at least we'll be covering some of these in the presentation at least, but that'll be good for people if they want to learn more about specific things with regards to ancient metal plates.
yeah. So now and I guess one more thing before I put the actual presentation up on the screen. I mentioned, so here's the actual paper format of it. You can maybe see here, it's 54 pages long. It's got, really extensive footnotes.
It'll dive into a lot more detail and depth. And am I right in thinking this hasn't been published yet?
This hasn't been published yet, which is why I put it on the screen. I want people to know it's real, it exists. But it'll be published by FAIR. They're publishing the proceedings of this conference that I spoke at. So all the gory details, all the footnotes, all the data points, all the sources for all of it, all the math, and we do a lot of math in this paper. So all of that is in this long form paper that will hopefully be available from FAIR within the next few months. I don't know what their timeline is on that, but I want people to see it exists. It's real. I'm not just making this up. So
You're showing the evidence of your artifact.
that's right.
Your
That's
article.
right. You don't have to see it with spiritual eyes. But anyway, I don't know how much you really want me to go into some of this, because people can just go watch the FAIR presentation. But I'll try to give just a pretty quick rundown, and you can interrupt me with your questions or whatever you want as I go.
Sure.
But I don't want it to feel too much like a rehash. And I will note, actually, there are some updates. There are a few things that I found after giving the presentation that I have put in the print version that will hopefully show up soon. And I'll mention a few of them here, but the basic idea is, for my presentation, was, since people had already done research on metal plates, and that had been done before, I didn't want to just rehash and be like, hey, there's metal plates, isn't that cool? I wanted to actually say, now that we have a whole bunch of ancient artifacts and ancient examples of writing on metal and things like that, why don't we take the metal plates, the descriptions of the metal plates we have from the witnesses, and let's compare that to what we actually find in the ancient world, and maybe kind of assess, is this a plausible or realistic description of a real artifact or not? Is this something ancient people were capable of? And so, first thing we need to know what the details are, right?
And I think that's a good approach or methodology, just to interrupt you here, because some critics have criticized that, apologists talk about like, oh yes, we found ancient metal plates throughout the world, but say, for example, like I think it was the Purgy tablets or other plates, which is maybe, say it's only like a couple of plates and it's a completely sort of type of record to the Book of Mormon, and they might criticize that, oh, well, finding just writing on metal doesn't necessarily corroborate the Book of Mormon.
Well, yeah, and certainly, and I don't know, I think most people, at least, I mean, maybe you can find some random apologist on the internet or something who has hyped this or whatever, but most people wouldn't say that finding writing on metal plates totally corroborates the Book of Mormon. But when you note, as we talked about at the beginning, people have criticized the idea of writing on metal plates, okay? And
that's an impossible or implausible notion.
Right. And so when that's the criticism that people have leveled, the mere existence of any writing on metal from the ancient world is counter evidence to that claim, right?
Right.
And so I think you have to be fair to what people are trying to counter with different types of evidence. Of course, that doesn't completely prove that people wrote giant books on gold plates all the time and stuff like that. But it does show, yes, people did write on metal plates. They had the technology, and if you can write on paper, a sticky note, a little sticky note, something short, then you're probably capable of writing something longer on paper, right? Like if it's a medium you're capable of writing on, then if you have the means and resources, then you can write something long on it. You can write different kinds of things on it. It doesn't, just because we have examples that have differences from the Book of Mormon doesn't mean something like the Book of Mormon couldn't be made. But I did want to, on some level, this is kind of intended to address that criticism, but I mentioned in part one, I think, maybe, I don't know, I don't remember, but I do research on things that I have questions about, right? And what drives me when I'm doing research, I mean, unless it's for work, right? I have things I'm assigned to do research for work here at Scripture Central. But when I do, my own sort of stuff, and you see me give a presentation like this, it's stuff that I just wondered about or I was curious about and wanted to figure it out. And I do the research until I'm satisfied with the answers. And so, then I present it, I try to get it published, I put it out there for other people to, decide what they think about it. But for me, it's like, hey, I was curious, was something like the gold plates actually how does that actually compare to some of our other ancient examples? And yeah, some critics have pointed out that like certain examples aren't really very similar to the Book of Mormon plates, and that's fair. But again, before you come to sweeping conclusions, there are tens of thousands of examples of writing on ancient metal plates in the world, from throughout the world. You've got to, there's a vast corpus of material that you've kind of got to sift through before you come to sweeping conclusions about whether the Book of Mormon really fits or not, right? So,
Right.
and
I feel like your research is quite a good, more comprehensive coverage of these ancient metal plate artifacts. And this is, for me personally, this has been a shelf item. Some of the criticisms leveled against the gold plates and could the text of the Book of Mormon have fit on it. And we're going to talk about that maybe a little bit later. But that's something which I have had questions on, and hopefully that your work will address some of those things.
Yeah. So, and I guess I should maybe put this in presentation mode rather than.
Oh yes.
Are you seeing the full presentation version now?
No.
Okay.
Not at the moment.
There. So how's that?
Yeah, that's better.
That has the full presentation, and I'm going to be over here in the slideshow. I might jump around rather than try to give the full presentation, but like I was saying, I kind of wanted to say, okay, let's actually look at what the witnesses describe and compare it against actual examples of writing on metal plates. And in some cases, I'm just looking at other metal artifacts to see what technologically people could do with metal. It's not necessarily inscriptions engraved on metal in those cases, but let's see, is this a plausible ancient artifact or not, right? And so you can kind of see, I've got the items here. This is just kind of a summary of what witnesses have said and how they've described the plates. The paper goes into all the sources for this, right? Quotes every single one. Well, not every single one, but quotes a ton. I probably overkilled it with primary source material, but those are the basic details. And so I kind of try to go point by point through these details and say, let's see what we find in the ancient world. So, first point here is the material appearance.
Yeah.
So, witnesses describe it as generally having the appearance of gold or golden plates, right? And there are some people want to hang very literally. There are a few statements where people say they're gold plates or pure gold. But none of these witnesses are metallurgists, right? None of them do some sort of metallurgical analysis. And one of the things that actually shows up when you read about things like Tumbagga and other like gold gilded artifacts is sometimes when you're directly recovering them out of the ground, you don't know what their metallurgical composition is unless you run an analysis. And so unless the witnesses themselves had the skills and knowledge to run a metallurgical analysis of the plates, they weren't going to know its literal composition. So they're just describing how it appeared, and what they saw maybe looked like pure gold. Good state of preservation. We talked a little bit about this last week when we were talking about the witnesses' statements. Josiah Stowell mentioned seeing a corner that looked like greenish stone, and that suggests there's copper in there. And William Smith did say it was a mixture of gold and copper. He might have picked that up from one of his brothers who was a formal witness. William Smith, of course, never sees the plates. But if they saw them and they had this general appearance of gold, they looked like they were well preserved, but there was maybe a little greenish tint in there or along the edges, that might have been a clue to some of the witnesses that there was copper mixed in. But is this a realistic description of ancient artifacts, right? We know this is stuff other people have covered, right? There's Tumbagga in pre-Columbian America, which is this gold copper silver alloy where they use this depletion gilding process to make it look like pure gold. And then you have there's also just gilded copper. So this is just where it's pure copper underneath, but they have electromagnetic or electrochemical processes that were being used in pre-Columbian America during Book of Mormon times even to to coat it with a layer of gold. And some of these artifacts, this is an example of a copper gilded artifact. You can see when they're recovered, they do have this greenish color corrosion on them. But once they get treated and cleaned, they still look like they're made of pure gold, right? It looks very golden. I like these as an example to just illustrate what the plates might have more realistically looked like. You've got a predominantly gold look, but you've got kind of some green along the edge, right? That's all.
Right.
That's all our witness evidence suggests, because that's all Josiah Stowell saw was a corner or edge, right?
So
But
you
here
would say there could have been some corrosion on the plates. I remember Dan Vogel brought that up to me about, it's a bit of a problem that apologists are arguing that the plates were Tumbagga because there would have been a lot of corrosion. Would the plates have been preserved in their condition for 1400 years? What would be your response to that?
Well, my response to that actually would be to show this right here. These are Tumbagga artifacts, and credit goes to Jerry Grover for actually being the one who found this. And he mentioned it in a podcast with Robert Boylan, your fellow Irishman.
Yes, that's right. The only other Mormon Irish YouTuber.
That's right. But he was on he went on Robert Boylan's podcast, and he was responding to that criticism, and he pointed out these artifacts here. And I don't have the picture that he did, but Jerry Grover showed a picture of the excavation site where they're digging this out of the ground, and you can see these artifacts there, the face ones at least. I don't know, I can't remember if he showed this one too, but the face mask pieces that were, this was a burial of a ruler. They call him the Lord of Sipan down in South America. And these were placed over his eyes, nose, and mouth, right, as part of the ritual for burying him or whatever. And these artifacts, they came out of the ground looking just like this. This is not after being cleaned up. This is not after being treated in any way for display. Jerry Grover shows the picture of them coming out of the ground, and they look like pure gold. So, and they date to 350 AD. Basically the time period of the plates. So these were in the ground. Excuse me. These were in the ground until from 350 AD about to like 1987 or something like that. So we're talking like 1600
and they were still preserved
years.
in good condition where there wasn't much corrosion, if any corrosion, that's
exactly
noticeable.
And these were not placed in like a cement box or anything. Like, they were placed right into the ground. They had contact with the soil, and they were preserved really, really well. Now, Jerry Grover does acknowledge that Sipan is a drier environment than upstate New York, but that's where like the box comes from, right? The box is designed
to help with preservation.
To help with preservation. And so they could have been in a generally good state of preservation, but nonetheless had a little bit of corrosion, right? I would call this a relatively good state of corrosion or preservation right here, right? But then had just a little bit of corrosion along the edge or on the corners or whatever, where it was exposed, and Josiah Stowell saw it, right? And that's, to me, that's the best explanation of the eyewitness testimony, right? We have testimony that there's corrosion on a corner or edge. We have testimony that it was in good state of preservation and it looked golden. So, it's something along those lines. And we have artifacts that have come out of the ground that illustrate this kind of appearance that we're talking about, right? These are some, obviously this bird pendant here is more corroded, but it shows you the greenish color on the golden. This frog pendant, though, pretty well preserved, generally golden color, right? But little just specks of greenish corrosion on there, right? If you saw this whole thing, you'd probably say, yeah, it had a golden appearance. But if you maybe only saw a corner or portion that had more of the green corrosion, that might be what stands out to you, right? This is an example where there is a lot more corrosion and then it had to be restored. I like this example. The provenance is a little uncertain because some of these auction sites have we don't know the provenance of the artifacts they're selling, these fine art artifacts. They're like looted and things like that. But it is very illustrative, I think. Again, you have a predominantly golden appearance. It's a really striking image over here, right, of the golden pendant. But you can see if you just saw like this edge right here, you might just the green might really stand out to you rather than the gold, right? So again, I think Tumbagga in particular, but even gold gilded copper, these processes, these technologies of metalworking that we know are available in pre-Columbian America.
Right. This material was used by
Yeah.
pre-Columbian Americans, Tumbagga, and it's a mixture of, you said, gold and copper and possibly silver as well.
Sometimes silver is worked in there. Sometimes, like, usually the silver is just an accident of nature, right? The gold and silver are found naturally alloyed together and they didn't separate them. So
right. And I remember, this is quite interesting. I remember reading this in Brant Gardner's book, and we might have talked about this in one of our interviews, but I remember he talked about in the Book of Mormon, like a couple of verses before Nephi started making, his record of plates, he talks about those materials, gold, silver, and copper, being present where Nephi was. I thought it was really interesting that almost came before then he started making the metal plates, sort of implying that those are the materials that were likely used for the gold plates.
That's right in the chapter break from 1 Nephi 18 to 19. And Brant Gardner is the one who pointed out there is no chapter break there in the original text. But because we usually read it with the chapter break, we don't notice this connection. But the very last verse of chapter 18, 1 Nephi 18, mentions finding ore and specifically names gold, silver, and copper. And that's it. That's all he mentions. And then he says, and then I made plates of ore. And the logical inference is that it's the gold, copper, silver ore. Yeah, I think it's just one of those little subtle details too that you're just kind of like, oh, that's interesting.
And answering another sort of superficial criticism, it probably is relevant to bring it up now. Critics have in the past attacked Joe Smith's claim that he had gold plates or plates with the appearance of gold, because if they were pure gold, the plates would have weighed like 200 pounds, so they would have been too heavy. And a lot of the eyewitnesses state the weight ranged between 40 to 60 pounds. But if it was Tumbagga, then that would have been around the approximate weight. Is that correct?
Yeah. I'm trying to see
of the dimensions which are sort of given for the plates.
I have stuff on that here, but yeah, the witnesses, you have William Smith describing them as 60 pounds. You have Samuel Smith, or not Samuel. You have here we go.
Apologies if I'm jumping ahead. I can't remember if you have a later slide.
No, we can jump ahead to whatever you'd like. So yeah, witnesses, you have William Smith who describes them as 60 pounds, right? Joseph Smith in one of the Hurlbut affidavits, so it's actually Willard Chase who says it, but he says Joseph Smith said they were either 60 or 40 pounds. You have Martin Harris giving weight twice. Once he says 40 to 60, once he says 50 to 60. And then you have this outlier from Joseph Smith Sr. from a really late secondhand source. So I don't put a lot of stock in it, but I do put it out there. It's part of the primary source data that it was 30 pounds. So somewhere kind of in that range, probably over 40 pounds, I would guess. I like I said, I don't put a lot of stock in the 30-pound statement, but somewhere between like 40 to 60 pounds. And yeah, people have criticized that because, a bound volume or a block of gold, right, that is 6 by 8 inches and 6 inches high, that's what a lot of the witnesses describe, would have weighed too much. And part of the response to that is, yes, if it's an alloy like Tumbagga, gold and copper, that significantly reduces its weight. The copper is lighter than gold. And so if it's mostly copper, it could be significantly lighter. But there's another component to that, and that is this idea that these are not isn't a solid brick of gold, right? This is individual leaves of plates, which would have airspace in between them, right? And you can actually see, I've got examples of this, right? This is a set of Korean gold plates. I think they might actually be silver gilded gold. The sources I had on that were a little ambiguous. And part of the problem is they were originally in Korean, and I think sometimes in translation, I don't know Korean, so I was using some machine translation to try and get more information about them.
Hmm.
I think sometimes in translation, silver and gold get mixed up with Korean. I don't know that for sure, but
And this is 6th century AD. This
yeah, this is around the 6th century AD. These are some Korean gold plates, but notice this edge, right? It's uneven. And you can
mhm.
see when these are stacked on top of each other, there weren't high resolution images of this, but you can see from these images, when this is the same set of plates, when they're stacked on top of each other, you can see there's space in between them. And you can see it really clearly here, right? And so this void space, this airspace, reduces the total weight that would be in a set of plates overall. And in fact, even like a couple years ago, there was someone on the ex-Mormon subreddit who like shared a picture of tin plates that they had made, talking about how like they were trying to prove Joseph Smith could make them with tin plates. And someone came on and was like, hey, the weight of those plates seems like it's not enough, because if this is tin, that much tin should weigh more. And the person responded, well, being like, well, because these are metal plates and there's space in between them, it reduces the weight by about 25%. And so, and that was, I think, machine made tin that was pretty even and pretty flat. And you still had void space in between those plates, and you see the weight of the plates goes down. And Jerry Grover, he actually talked about these Tumbagga sheets that were found in Narino, Colombia, because their thickness variation was measured in a study done by I think the scholar's name was David Scott, the scholar that Grover was citing. But they have this thickness variation, right? And that's what's contributing to this, like when you have metal items stacked on top of each other like this, plates or whatever, it's because there's unevenness in the individual plates. And so these Tumbagga discs and sheets, their unevenness was actually measured, and they had a variation ranging from 5.9 to 39%. And so he kind of suggests from that, well, if you had a maximum thickness variation point of 39% and you had two pieces stacked on top of each other, and their 39% deflection points were touching, that could create as much as 78% air gap between each plate. Now that wouldn't
Right, so
be
the plates may
consistent.
not be perfectly flat on top of
Yeah,
each other.
yeah, and obviously you're not going to have 78% air gap consistently throughout. He kind of assumes an average of 50% airspace, which I actually think might be a little. Some people might feel like that's a little excessive, but I mean, it's, you can, if you don't think 50% works, like you can redo the math and do it with other examples if you want to. But once you consider like all of these factors, the void space and things like that, right? These are just some of the different proposals that have been made, and these scholars do kind of all the math for this, right? This was Reed Putnam in the 1960s. If you had 20 plates per inch, this is how thick they'd be, and then you assume 50% void space. If the plates were 4 inches high, which is what Martin Harris says, the stack of 4 inches of plates, you would have 80 plates, and they would weigh between 35 and 57 pounds, depending on the exact ratio of gold and copper in the Tumbagga alloy, right? If you have 6 inches of plates, you'd have 120 plates, and you have 53 pounds to 86 pounds. So, I won't read off all of this. Jerry Grover is the one who's really done the most thorough work on this, and he assumes more plates per inch. He assumes thinner plates, right? And he just assumes a 6-inch stack. So these are his numbers. I just reduced his math by 1/3 and give an estimate for if it was a 4-inch stack like Martin Harris does.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of the range. Like I said, Jerry's done the most thorough work. So if you pushed me, I didn't, in this presentation when I gave it, I didn't play any favorites. I just said, hey, this is the range of possibilities scholars have discussed.
Right.
If you pushed me, I would choose something within this range here that from Jerry's work, because like I said, it's just been the most thorough and comprehensive, and he does all the math, more complicated math than I ever do. So, so if you push me, that's kind of where I would assume the set of plates was somewhere between one of these two sets of numbers here. But yeah, once you understand that they're not pure gold, they're made of Tumbagga, they're not a block of metal, they're individual sheets and things like that, and you look at and you can look at the data from ancient examples like Jerry Grover has and things like that. We can figure out about how much it would have weighed, and it fits within the range of the weight range of the plates, as you can see from these examples here of what people have talked about.
Right. So Jerry Grover, he's saying, and other people you have here, if the plates weigh, if they were 6 inches in height, which is what most common the eyewitnesses say, and they weigh between, he has here 53 to 57.9 pounds, similar to what the witnesses said, that there could have been between 300, 600 plates stacked. A question I have, and I don't know whether to bring it up now or later, but part of me thinking, does he address or does he state how thick each individual plate would be then, in sort of like in millimeters? And this might come later when critics would say, the plates had to be a certain amount of thickness in order for there to have been engravings on both sides and to, fit them in, say, 6 inches.
Yeah. So, so you can see I put it in inches. I'm sorry, I'm an American. I know over there in the UK and the rest of the world, you want your metric system.
Well, I think an inch is 2.5 centimeters roughly. So
yeah,
that's about 25 millimeters, I think, is an inch.
So yeah, something. I think 25.3 millimeters is an inch, I think. So yeah, that's an approximate conversion ratio, but in my defense, the witnesses measure things in inches, right? Because they're Americans too. So
right.
we have he did what he did is his two different estimates for 300 to 600 plates depends on either a plate that's 0.01 inches, which I think is like it's a little more than 2 millimeters or 0.2 of a millimeter. Okay.
Yes, that'd be right. Yeah.
It's a little more than 0.2 of a millimeter. If the plates are that thick, then you can have 300 of them, right? And in a 6-inch stack. If they're half as thick, so 0.005 inches, which is a little bigger than 1/10 of a millimeter, then you can have 600 of them. But yeah, critics have, oh, that's too thin or whatever. What Jerry Grover actually does, and he does this in his book where he talks about this stuff, he actually gets copper sheets. He uses copper and then he gets one Tumbagga sheet that are, when he's testing to see how thin something has to be able to be pliable, right? Because you have sources that describe the plates as being pliable, and I think I have, yeah. So this is you have Emma Smith, who talks about the plates being like thick paper. She says they're pliable as she thumbs the edge, and you've got others like William Smith who thumbs the edge of plates and stuff. So Jerry Grover tested to see how thin copper plates had to be able to be pliable, and he found that a range between 0.005 inches and 0.01 inches, what we were talking about, that's how thick copper of that thickness can be pliable. I bump it up in this range here to 0.007 rather than going all the way down to 0.005, because when he then tested that with a Tumbagga sheet, a manufactured sheet of gold, silver, copper alloy that was a similar ratio to what he determined the plates had to be, the thinnest he could get was about 0.007, and it was still pliable. I bumped the range up to 0.015 instead of 0.001, because David Baird, who's a metallurgist, he ran some tests himself, and he used brass. And I don't know how the thickness or stiffness of brass compares to Tumbagga necessarily, but he used brass and determined that somewhere between 0.001 and 0.0015 was thin enough to get that pliable effect, right? And so Jerry Grover tested all of this, and then he tested to see if he could engrave using like tools that would have been available, not using like an X-Acto knife, but using like a sharpened stick or bone or something like that. I think he used a sharpened stick. But he suggested maybe they could have used bone or something in antiquity. But using like just a sharpened stick, he tested to see if he could engrave on one side and have it not push through, and then turn around and engrave the other side and have that not push through, and be able to engrave on both sides. And he found that he could successfully engrave on something as thin as 0.005 inches. So again, that's a little more than 1/10 of a millimeter. He could successfully, with a Tumbagga sheet, engrave both sides, or with I think it was a copper sheet, but Tumbagga is harder and stiffer than copper alone anyway. So if you could do it on copper, it could be done on a harder material like Tumbagga. But that's all. That's
they could have been that thin, 1/10 of a millimeter, and
yeah.
He says he was able to etch, to do engravings on both sides. That's amazing.
Yeah, and actually, let me show you something I found after I gave my fair presentation. These are just some different examples of plates that have similar size dimensions to the Book of Mormon plates, right? So these are like 8x7. These are 6x7. These are those Korean plates I was talking about earlier. But more interesting is the examples of thin plates, right? And these Maya gold discs, they're about 1 millimeter thick, or maybe a little thicker. This is an example of Tumbagga from like the 5th century AD. So that's the 400s AD. So this is Moroni's time period. Piece of Tumbagga found in Mesoamerica. It's 0.03 to 0.04 centimeters thick, right? So that's like 0.3 to 0.4 millimeters.
Right.
So this doesn't have engraving on it, but we know that people could make really thin Tumbagga sheets, right? In Book of Mormon times. This is, I don't know, this is an image that was in this article here. And in this article is where Warwick Bray talks about how in the Andes, so in Peru, northern Peru, they were able to make Tumbagga sheets as thin as 0.02 centimeters or 0.2 millimeters, right?
Wow.
Yeah, so they could make Tumbagga that thin. Could you engrave it? Could you actually engrave both sides of something like that? Well, this is from the Old World, but this is a Samaritan silver amulet. And this is really fascinating. Most of the time, these little silver amulets or gold amulets are only written on one side. But this one actually has engraving on both sides of the text. And it is 0.01 centimeters, or it's 1/10 of a millimeter thick.
And it has engravings on both sides.
And it has engravings on both sides. Now, the engraving does show through on each side, but maybe that tells us something about our assumptions. Like, we assume they wouldn't have written on both sides if it pushed through, but maybe they don't care. Maybe they're willing to write on both sides, even though the text will push through. And you keep in mind that, like, the witnesses said, or some sources say that the text had been darkened black, right? And so if they're darkening the text on the proper side black to help it be more legible, then maybe the writing pushing through from the other side isn't that big of a deal for its legibility, because you're going to follow where the black staining of the text is, rather than engraving both sides, rather than like being concerned about whether it pushes through. But
push through, right? Okay.
I want to note, though, again, Jerry Grover tested something just barely thicker than this, right? This is 0.004 inches, is about what 1/10 of a millimeter is. He found that at just 0.005 inches, he could engrave both sides without it pushing through. So I'm not saying it pushed through, but what I am saying is we have evidence of people engraving both sides on really, really thin material. And they apparently it didn't bother them that it pushed through. They still wrote on both sides sometimes. So maybe we don't even need to assume it doesn't push through to make it work.
So you're saying that there was like a black color description, and that would have sort of highlighted one side, even if engravings did come through on one side, that wouldn't necessarily have been a problem according to that description that might have been on the gold plates.
So let's just jump through. You can skip, you can edit this to eliminate all my.
Oh yeah, that's fine.
You want, but so yeah, you have sources. Orson Pratt describes the plates being filled with the characters being filled with a black hard stain, and he says he got that description from the 8 witnesses. And obviously this is a modern replica that looks very modern, but you can see the black standing out really clearly.
Right.
William Appleby also mentions this. I think he got it from a sermon from Orson Pratt. So that's really kind of just, he's getting it secondhand or third hand really from Orson Pratt. But Orson Pratt says he got it from the 8 witnesses. And then Francis Gladden Bishop is this interesting guy. He claims to have had a vision where he saw the plates and describes them as having the characters being rubbed over with a black substance. But Don Bradley has argued, and I think he's correct, that what Bishop is actually doing is he's close friends with and he has a close confidant with Martin Harris. And so what Don thinks he's actually doing is he's talking to Martin and getting a description of the plates from Martin, and then either maybe having like a real visionary experience that's influenced by what Martin says, or making up a visionary experience and then relaying accurate information about the plates from Martin in his description to make his description sound more plausible. So that's in Don Bradley's book on the 116 pages. And so I think that's kind of another corroboration of it. It's not, we don't have great source material. It'd be great if we had one of the actual witnesses saying it, but we have these sources from people who knew the witnesses and talked to the witnesses who say there's this black staining of the characters. And we do have examples of this in the ancient world too, right? This is one that Jerry Grover pointed out from, the gold-plated Darius, where you clearly have, you can see in the cuneiform wedges, they look dark, they look blackened. We don't know for sure if this was a deliberate thing they did, or if it's like a result of corrosion that got into the engraving. Here's one where I think it's a little more clear though. This is a gold tablet from Ashurnazirpal.
That's not easy to say.
that's quite the tongue twister, yeah. From the 9th century BC, so this is definitely predates Lehi and Nephi and stuff like that. And you can really see like these wedges, like the cuneiform wedges have been darkened with something. Is it possible they were corroded and it's corrosion that got caught in there? Again, I haven't found any studies that say, but again, you can clearly see it's not just like the lighting on the image or whatever. You can clearly see that there is some darkened substance in these cuneiform wedges. And another thing, people call this a gold tablet, but if you look closely, I haven't seen anyone talking about the metallurgical composition, but it looks like there's like hints of green in the metal. And so I do wonder if this actually has some copper mixed into it.
Yeah, I can kind of sort of see like some shades of like browny green sort of colors.
Yeah, and I mean it's not like a vibrant gold like like this Darius plate is, right? It's a lot more of a muted sort of golden color. It's almost kind of copperish looking, but it's called a golden tablet. So I do wonder if this actually has some copper in it, and maybe this is a really good representation of what like one of the plates might have looked like, right? You've got black text, you've got a goldish color. Maybe there's a little greenish in there, and that's how people figure out that maybe they're gold mixed with copper or whatever. But anyway, that's kind of an aside to this point here. But people apparently did, or whether they did it intentionally or not, they made inscriptions that when they were dug out of the earth thousands of years later have black text. But Jerry Grover thinks that they were done deliberately, and he's probably right because of, in part, just how even, right, the corrosion is. You don't see like different colors of corrosion or discoloration. It's an even dark color, right? And the plates are described as having like this even dark black stain. But you have examples of like Tumbagga discs here. where they're deliberately creating a bicolored effect on the disc. And there was actually scientific experimentation that was done in modern times to see how this could be done. And you can see this example from the scientific testing. That looks like engraving, black engraving on gold, right? So this is using pre-Columbian technology. You could have created this effect, right? This golden with black effect on it. And something that I think is important to understand. So I mentioned David Baird earlier, and he's a metallurgist who's created like replicas of the plates. He actually thinks that the plates were etched rather than engraved. And Jerry Grover considers that possibility, but he doesn't, he kind of concludes probably not. But it is interesting because etching technology is available in pre-Columbian America. It's how they're doing some of these like designs and things like that. They don't write with etching, but they do create patterns on Tumbagga artifacts and things like that through etching, acid etching over the surface. In fact, it's a similar process to how they do the depletion gilding. And I'm not going to go into the sciencey explanation of it because I'm not a scientist and I don't really do that. But they do acid etching of Tumbagga artifacts. And if you are etching, right, you don't have to engrave nearly as far into the metal to get the writing to show up. The etching process that David Baird talks about is where you would cover it over with like a black pitch or something like that, and then you just lightly with a stylus of some sort scratch your writing onto like the very surface of it, and then you'd wash that pitch off with acid, and the acid would burn into the part that you engraved, and it would burn in. It would be just micrometers, right? Micrometers thick engraving that wouldn't push through to the other side, even on really thin plates. And it would have this blackened stain on it and everything. So again, the witnesses.
So you're proposing the possibility of etching versus engraving.
Yeah, the witnesses' descriptions all use the word engraving and they make it sound like it's being actually engraven. And so based on eyewitnesses, maybe engraving is more likely. But I also think it's important to note that, like, again, just like with the gold versus Tumbagga, these aren't metallurgists, these aren't experts who are like examining it. Like, I wouldn't count on their terminology being like so precise to distinguish the difference between etching and engraving, right? Yeah. So it's entirely possible, it's within the realm of possibility that they used etching instead, and that would enable them to use really thin metal and not have it push through to the other side.
Okay.
So
makes sense. Okay, I know I've been asking a bunch of questions and we've sort of been jumping around. Maybe we could go back a little bit to some of the metal plates in the ancient world. And are there any sort of ancient metal plate documents which bear any similarities to being like a longer, like more lengthy sort of record? Because that's one thing that's quite unique about the Book of Mormon, is that it's a lengthy historical metal record, multiple plates, perhaps hundreds. Maybe you could talk a little about that, what there is in the ancient world.
Yeah, absolutely. So we already talked about this table I have here. Let's see, what do I have before that? Yeah. Where based on the eyewitnesses' descriptions, these are kind of figuring out, given our weight limitations and our size limitations, how many plates could there be, right? So Reed Putnam, maybe between 80 and 120 plates for him. Robert Smith, 80 to 134 or 120 to 200. We already talked about Jerry Grover's. Bruce Dale is a little different from all these other studies because he's not, he's basically taking the weight dimension and saying, okay, if you have that much weight, and if you have, and if the plates are made of Tumbagga, and he uses Jerry Grover's calculated ratios of Tumbagga, he says, how many plates could there be if they're between this thickness? And we already talked about the thickness of the plates, right?
Right.
And he comes up with, well, in order to weigh this much, there could only be between 140 to 418 plates, depending on if it's the minimum thickness or the maximum thickness of what he considers. But basically, our range then, right, is an absolute minimum of 80 total plates, an absolute maximum of 600 plates. That gives us a surface area, which gives us something to work with in terms of like comparing it against other examples of writing on metal. Did people write on surface area comparable to, between 7,680 square inches to 5,000 or 57,600 square inches of metal? Did people do that? And you have this example of the Korean book I already talked about. I don't give the surface area here because the plates are about the size of Book of Mormon plates, and I was being lazy with my math. So
because the Book of Mormon plates are described 8x6 in most accounts.
8x6. There are, like, Oliver Cowdery mentions is quoted as saying 7x6, and you've got others who give 8x7, right? So there's some variation, but the standard,
they're all approximates, aren't they?
Yeah, they're all approximates. The standard that people use is 8x6 usually, and that's the standard I used in my math here, right? But I was being lazy, so I thought, 19 plates, about the same size as the Book of Mormon. So, that's a pretty long text, right? Being engraved on 19 Book of Mormon sized plates, just about. This is the copper scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls. Its total surface area is over 2,000 square inches. It's about the equivalent of 22 Book of Mormon plates, right? So you have, that's smaller than our total range for the set of plates, but that's a pretty sizable metal document right there. I really like this example, these engraving bronze tablets from Italy. These are from the 1st through 3rd centuries BC. There's only 7 tablets, so you think, oh, that's not very impressive. And they aren't bound together, but they're a collection of laws and rituals that were held by this priestly order in pre-Roman, pre-Roman priestly order.
Mm-hmm.
So it's maybe comparable to something like the priestly source in the Pentateuch or something, right? This collection of laws and regulations for this priestly order. But the size of the plates are so much bigger than the Book of Mormon plates. The total space of these 7 tablets is 5,849, for almost 850 square feet, right? That comes out to about 61 Book of Mormon plates. And this is not the complete collection. There were 9 tablets originally found, but 2 were lost before they were ever scientifically measured or studied. So how big were those? How much does that expand our size? And even with those 2 lost tablets, scholars don't think this is the complete collection. This is just a portion of what they think was the full library kept by this priestly order. So this is probably much bigger sort of record on metal plates, on bronze tablets here. You have Roman legal tablets. This is actually new. I didn't include this in my fair presentation because I found out about it afterwards, but this is a set of Roman legal tablets from the 1st century AD. There's 10 tablets, and look how massive these are. These are, each tablet is about 23 by 36 inches. That's basically the 36 inches. That's basically
nearly
a meter,
2 by 3
right?
feet, isn't it?
Yeah.
Oh.
2 feet by 3 feet. There's 10 of them, and they were mounted on the wall, lined up. And so it would have been like 30 meters or 30 yards, right? Or not 30 yards, 10 yards, 10 meters, my bad, 30 feet worth of metal plates, of a metal document stretching across the wall, mounted side by side. That total surface area, the 16,600 or 16,300 and almost 10 feet, right? That's about 170 Book of Mormon plates, right? So that's within the range of what people have estimated for the whole set of Book of Mormon plates, between the 80 to 600, right? And then you have these plates from India. I don't know. I have to caveat. I don't know if the image here is the specific set of plates described in my caption. I couldn't confirm that, but I wanted, since I'm talking about a fairly large set, I wanted an image that helps you see like a large amount of plates, right? But this
Right.
is, these are bound by a ring. This is from about the 10th century AD. So it's a little later than Book of Mormon times, but it's still first millennium, right? First
Right.
millennium AD. There's 57 plates in this set. Those plates are generally between 15 to 16 inches long and 8 to 9 inches wide. I have the exact dimensions in my paper, and this was a hard one to do the math for because there was like variation on the size of the plates across the thing. So I had to do like tons of little math on every single plate to figure out the total square inches. But again, this is over 16,000, almost 17,000, really 16,700 square feet. It's about the equivalent of 174 Book of Mormon plates. So again, it's a really long, really sizable document that's written on metal plates here. The volume of metal is comparable to what would have been required for the Book of Mormon plates. This is another one. Again, I don't know if the image correlates with my caption here, but the details in the caption, this is a little later, the 11th century, early or mid 11th century, but 86 plates, and you
That's
can
quite
see
a big
how
number.
large they are. Yeah. 24,000, almost 25,000 square feet, the equivalent of 258 Book of Mormon plates in terms of its
Surface
space.
area.
Surface area, yeah. So again, we absolutely have examples, and they're bound by a ring. They're not 3 rings bound, but they are bound by rings, right? We have these examples of metal records, metal documents that are pretty comparable in terms of their size to the Book of Mormon. And then one last example that I included, again, they're not bound in this case, but this is a corpus of, this is called the Tevram plates from India. The document, this is a kind of a collection of documents that were kept in a temple in India, and it's a defined corpus of texts. So it's like it's a sacred corpus from this temple of like hymns and things like that. It'd be like if you found the Book of Psalms engraved on metal or something like that from like a biblical perspective. These are like liturgical sacred hymns that are being written down on these copper plates, and there were 439 of them. And they're quite a bit larger. Their total surface area is the equivalent of 812 Book of Mormon plates, approximately, right? So,
So in India, they kept long metal records.
yeah, in India, this long metal records thing is all over the place in India. And I didn't put this in my presentation because it's kind of a later source anyway. I do mention it briefly in my paper, but like there's actually an example of a guy, a single guy from the 14th century AD who wrote like 13,000 like hymns and poems and things like that. And all of his works were copied contemporaneously onto metal plates and kept in an archive. And it was an archive of over 2,000 metal plates in India that was like hidden in a temple somewhere. Again, it's a lot later, but because it's like the 14th century, but there's this long tradition. The earliest plates we have from India are like the 3rd century AD. And so you do have them doing this kind of stuff going back really early. But in India, you have this long, like over 1,000-year tradition of writing pretty extensively on metal. And then you have, in addition to what's actually attested, again, I didn't mention this in my presentation, but it's in my paper. You have examples of historical sources which talk about large archives and things like that. So you have some Buddhist sources from like the 6th and 7th century. They report on a king from the Kushan dynasty of northern India in the 2nd century AD They describe him writing what's called the Great Commentary. It's the second longest sacred Buddhist text in the world. It has over 1 million verses in it, broken down in like 300 stanzas. They describe this king having that massive commentary copied onto copper plates and stored in stone boxes. Now, nothing like that has ever been found archaeologically. So we can't, was it ever really done or not? I don't know. But in the
Some
context of,
historical sources suggesting, although we haven't found evidence.
yeah, we have historical sources suggesting it. And in the context of this record keeping practice in India, where we do know they are keeping really large, pretty sizable documents on metal and copying long texts onto metal and keeping large archives on metal, this is not an implausible like thing historically. You can't really dismiss it out of hand, right? And we also have like Chinese Buddhist sources that talk about from the same time period, or from a little later, from the 8th century, that talk about the perfection of wisdom. This is another Buddhist text. It's actually the longest Buddhist text in the world. I don't know exactly how long it measures if you like translate it out and put it in English or whatever, but it has 6.4 million Chinese characters in it. So it's really long. There are like critical edition volumes, and it's like a 3-volume set in its academic critical edition, but that has like a bunch of like academic notes and commentary in it. So that's probably not how long the text itself is, but it's a really long text. And again, this is really plausible to me in light of like the so this Korean set of plates, it's a sacred Buddhist text. I can't remember which one it is off the top of, it's the Diamond Sutra is what it is. So the idea that in Southeast Asia there might have been a really long text engraved on gold of this sacred Buddhist scripture around the middle of the first millennium AD, that's very believable because we have found examples not quite as long or large as the one we have traditional sources about, but we found examples that are pretty sizable, pretty long, pretty substantive. And so it's entirely plausible that something like the entire perfection of wisdom was copied onto gold at some point, and we've maybe just lost it. But whether or not those really ever existed, the point is there's absolutely documentation and evidence for really long documents on gold, on copper. I would love it if it were coming from ancient America or coming from the ancient Near East, right?
Well, that was going to be the question I was going to ask you. Is a critic or a skeptic might say, okay, it's interesting you're finding some longer metal ancient artifacts in Asia, India, South Korea, even maybe ones in say like Italy or Spain. But what about the Middle East, near Israel or pre-Columbian America? Because that's more relevant to the Book of Mormon. If we're not finding it there, then is it still anachronistic or an outlier, or it doesn't really fit? What would be your response to that?
Yeah, so part of my response would be to start off going back to like what we were talking about, like the original criticism about metal plates is that it just wasn't done. And then we were like, okay, actually, look, there is examples of metal plates. And then people were like, oh, but that's not really evidence because they're not like the Book of Mormon plates or whatever. It's like, okay, but it's like moving the goalposts a little bit, right? People have made the criticism, well, there aren't any long texts on metal. Well, actually, yes, there are. There's an abundant examples of long texts. Well, but they're not from the right time. They're not from the right place.
Yeah.
Okay. You should have said that the first time, right? Because you're now modifying the criticism. And that's a fair point, right? The evidence would be stronger if it came from the right time and place. That's a fair point to make. But you can't maintain that something like the Book of Mormon is impossible anymore, because we absolutely have examples of really lengthy documents on metal. It's conceivable for people in the ancient world to have done this, right? And that would be part of my response. The other part would be, one of the examples of fairly long, not as long as the Book of Mormon text or the Book of Mormon, the set of Book of Mormon plates, but fairly long, is the Dead Sea Scrolls copper scroll. That's from the right time, right? It's a little later. It's too late for Lehi and Nephi, right? But we do have it in the somewhat long example in the right place.
Right.
I would also point out, like, so like these Iguvine bronze tablets are from Italy, which is Eastern Mediterranean. It's not ancient Near East. It's not the core of the ancient Near East, but it's starting to get within that realm, right? And you even have like this Roman example. It's from Spain, which is the Western Mediterranean, but it's the Roman practice, and Roman practice spreads all over the ancient world, right? And so the origin of the practice is going to be in Rome, in Italy, right? Which obviously doesn't spread to the ancient Near East before Lehi and Nephi leave. But again, basically we can kind of sandwich them in between, right? We have, on the one side, we have these East Asian and Indian examples to the east of the ancient Near East. And then we have long examples of writing on metal to the west of the ancient Near East, in Italy and the Roman Empire and things like that. And so is it really that much of a stretch that kind of practice maybe did occur? Maybe we just haven't found maybe not as extensively, but that kind of practice did occur, or that someone in the ancient Near East through trade could have learned about that kind of practice and thought, yeah, I could make long records on metal plates too. Like, is it really totally inconceivable? The region has kind of been sandwiched by examples of long writing on metal plates here.
And
It'd be kind
certainly,
of,
if you believe the Book of Mormon and its narrative, Lehi and his family would have brought the brass plates over with them, and certainly
right.
that would have been a factor influencing them to have kept a metal record in
Yeah,
the Americas.
the Book of Mormon, as far as I'm concerned, the Book of Mormon doesn't require it to be a widespread cultural practice in the Americas, because the origin of the practice, yeah, just like you mentioned, is the old world. Nephi and Lehi are bringing that practice with them. So as far as like the origin of it, we should expect to find that. We should be looking to the old world for that. But the Nephites may have been the only ones who bothered writing extensive records in the New World. And, believe me, I would be the first to say it'd be awesome if we could find one of their records, right? But part of the whole purpose and the whole context of the Book of Mormon is the records were all hidden in one place, and they've never been found since. And maybe they were, I mean, for all we know, aside from what was recovered from the hill Cumorah, right, or the hill in New York, aside from what Moroni took separately and put there, the rest of the records may have been destroyed by the Lamanites. I mean, that's the concern throughout the whole Book of Mormon. And then we also know a bunch of gold is getting destroyed and melted down after after the Spanish come and
Yeah, I remember Brent
stuff
Garner
like that.
talking about that. Like after the Spanish conquest, a lot of probably their texts would have been destroyed, Mesoamerican people.
But I mean, there was in like, I'm trying to remember the exact details. So there is an account from Jose Antonio Gay, who's a Mexican historian of the late 19th century. And he talks about, he's writing a history of Oaxaca in central Mexico. And he just, in passing, he mentions that the natives, the locals, were trading to European antiquarians. They were trading thin sheets of gold, evidently worked with a hammer, on which were engraved ancient hieroglyphs. He just mentions this in passing, and it's never mentioned again. No, like, artifacts like that have turned up in like European antiquities markets or whatever. And so we can't really know much about what that is, but there is this kind of this historical account that reports that there were there was writing on gold. There were writings on gold in Mesoamerica after that were being traded and shared with Europeans after the post-Columbian period.
Yeah.
So the idea that there is some practice of writing on metal in Mesoamerica, it's not a lot, but there is some evidence for it. But that was
You just may not have any archaeological evidence for it.
I mean, we do have, I mentioned, where did I mention those? Like, we do have these gold discs, these gold Mayan discs that have a few glyphs along the edges, right? Yes. And those are being engraved. You have other examples where they don't have glyphs on the edge, but the design on them is being etched. I mentioned how they have this etching technology there. But scholars can't even make heads or tails of what these glyphs along the edge mean. So it's obviously a very minor example, but like the concept of putting writing down on metal did occur to some people in Mesoamerica. We have a little bit of historical evidence, this historical account of that kind of thing happening. But because we don't have the examples, we can't really say much about when it was, how extensive the writing was, what kinds of things they wrote on there. There's not a lot we can go off of with that. But the Nephite practice is clearly grounded in what they brought with them from the old world in the first place. So
right. And I feel like what your presentation is showing is, yes, maybe we can't show examples or definitive evidence in the Middle East or in Mesoamerica, in the Americas, of long metal records being kept, but you can show it places in Europe or in Asia. So the argument that it is completely absurd or impossible for ancient Nephite authors to have written a long metal record, you're showing that it may be an outlier in Mesoamerica. We may not have other evidence, but it's not impossible when you look at what ancient people have done throughout the ancient world.
Yeah, well, exactly. And so, yeah, it's not totally absurd. And the core of my presentation is primarily about the plates that we talked about in our last episode, right? The evidence from the witnesses tells us that there are real plates that exist, right?
Yes.
And so part of what I'm kind of focused on is, well, based on what they're describing, is it something ancient people really could have made? Is it realistically something an ancient person could have made rather than something that was made like by a modern person? And we talked about I don't think it's realistically something Joseph Smith could have forged. I don't think he had the skill set to make it. It's beyond his skill set. And so part of my argument is like, it's not beyond the skill set and the range of known, attested sorts of practices for ancient people to make an artifact like this.
Right.
Now, if you want to then argue from there, okay, well, so the artifact we know Joseph Smith had realistically could have been an ancient artifact. Now you maybe get into arguments about, okay, how did he get it? Where did it really come from? If you don't want to accept that an angel showed him where to find it and it was made by people from the ancient world, come up with whatever other hypothesis you want. He found a looted example of India plates. I don't know, whatever, right? Like,
well, it's funny. I have a family member who is no longer a believer, but rejects the main critical theory whenever I talk about Dan Vogel's theory about Joseph manufacturing, making his own set of tin plates, and that he was able to trick the witnesses with them. She did not buy that at all. She was like, no, there's no evidence of Joseph making his own set of metal plates. She was like, I just don't see him do that. Surely somebody would have, there would have been some source or allegation of I think I might have seen Joseph Smith, getting some tin from somewhere. And I was like, yeah, I agree with you. And her theory is that he just found a set of metal plates in the hill from treasure digging. And I was like, well, okay, I always find that harder to believe than I would buy more he just made his own set of metal plates, but I find that also very hard to believe. But it's interesting that people have to come up with some sort of explanation for if not
so
the divine claim.
That's basically kind of where I'm coming from, is the question, is this artifact that we know existed, because we have compel, or at least I know existed. I feel confident saying it existed, right? Is this artifact realistically fit within the known practices, the scope of people's practices in the ancient world when making metal documents? And in order to understand that, you need to look at the full range of known attested practices. Like I was saying, there's over 10,000 examples of writing on metal. You need to look at that full breadth, that full context in order to answer that question. If you want to, once you've established that, yes, it can be plausibly fits within that, then you can start to look at more of the specifics and be like, okay, well then how, if the practices aren't widely attested in ancient America, how did it end up in New York? How did Joseph Smith get a hold of it? Where did this come from, right? You can start asking those kinds of questions if you want to, but the first question for me is just, does it actually fit within ancient practices in general?
Right, and it's quite apparent to me that from what you've shown that ancient people were quite skilled at this, writing in metal, and it's something that we definitely don't have that skill. We don't need to have that skill anymore, with paper and stuff. So to me, it seems like, well, this is a plausible thing that ancient people, as you have shown throughout the world, have done, and they could have done as well. Because why not? What do they find more probable? This being written by ancient people, an ancient record, or Joseph Smith creating his own set of plates. And obviously that's a personal decision people have to make on that.
Yeah, and one of the things I think I mentioned it in like the end of my presentation, but like while we don't have lots of explicit examples of, or we don't really have any explicit examples of like extensive writing on metal plates in ancient America or whatever, the technology to do everything you need to do to make these plates does exist in pre-Columbian America. A lot of it exists. It pretty much all exists in South America by Book of Mormon times. It's getting up into Central America and starting to reach Mesoamerica by the tail end of Book of Mormon times. So again, at the very least, for the artifact we know exists, the one that Joseph Smith claims to possess, that he says was made by Mormon and Moroni, right? We have all the technology, the ability to make Tumbagga, the ability to make Tumbagga really thin, the ability to engrave, right? To write and engrave, whether they actually did it or not, we know they have the skill and the ability to do it, precisely because we have things like these gold Maya discs and things like that, which are a little later than the Book of Mormon, but we have, like I said, we have the etching technology is there, at least in South America. We have like all the technology needed to the ability to create this black on gold look, which we already talked about, right? For the characters, that technology all exists, and it all exists within pre-Columbian America. Most of it can be shown to exist in Book of Mormon times. A lot of it already, or at least starting to reach Mesoamerica by Moroni's time. It's really not, for me, people can decide for themselves, but for me, it's really not a stretch to say maybe you have people with old world technological skills doing this a little earlier and taking advantage of some of the technology they know about in the new world through trade or whatever, right? Making an artifact like this, the technology is there to be able to do it.
Yeah, it's not beyond the realm of possibility, because I remember when I had my discussion with Frank Gardner and Dr. John Lundwall was sort of making the argument this almost seems impossible. They wouldn't have written these ancient Mesoamerican people long sort of historical literate records, and Brown was making the point that like they could have written whatever they want. Whether or not they did or not, that's a different question, but it was certainly within the realm of possibility. And as you said, they would have had the technology and skills available to have done it if they wanted to.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's exactly what's true. And that's the thing. So I'm not an anthropologist, but I've talked to a lot of them. People like Brandt, some others. And I actually brought some criticisms about like long metal plates up to an anthropologist once before I ever did any of this research. I'm not going to name them because I don't have personal, like, permission to share this personal conversation all over the internet. But, I asked him about it, and he responded basically with exactly what you said. He's like, look, once the technology to do it is demonstrated to exist in a place, then anything is possible to be done with that technology. They can do whatever they want. And whether we have evidence for that specific thing or not, or whatever. And so the question of whether you could make the gold plates, whether something like them, like the Book of Mormon plates could have been made, that's a question of whether the technology's there.
Yeah.
If it is, then it's possible. And
yeah, because if there's not evidence for other long ancient records coming from Mesoamerica, that doesn't therefore mean it definitely couldn't have happened. This therefore didn't happen.
And you might say, well, yeah, it's possible, but it's implausible or improbable because we don't have this, like, hey, maybe if we were claiming it came from India, this would be really compelling and interesting, and it'd be really plausible. And actually, my wife, when I was doing this research, she commented, if you went to like historians of India and told them about an ancient record on metal plates that was really long and had history written on it and all this stuff, they probably wouldn't even flinch. They'd just be like, yeah, that seems perfectly reasonable. And that's probably true.
There's probably going to be someone watching this presentation that's going to change their geography model to India.
Someone's going to come up
in
with
light of this evidence.
the Indian model. Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think it'd be really plausible in that sort of context or whatever. And so some people might say, well, it's still implausible, but for me, it goes back to, again, do the plates actually exist? And the witness testimony tells us that it does. And so when we're trying to decide what is really probable or plausible or possible, we have to be operating within the confines of, there is an artifact that existed. What are more or less likely explanations of it? And I've already expressed my point of view. I find it very unlikely Joseph Smith made a fake set of plates. So to me, it appears plausible that they're a real ancient set of plates. And once you've come to that conclusion, again, now it's not a matter of, it's a matter of understanding, like, okay, well, how then? How would they have made them? What kind of tools, what kind of methods, what kind of technology is available in the ancient world to make a record like the one described by the Book of Mormon? And again, if you're not willing to look throughout the entire world to see what kinds of techniques are within the realm of possibility, you're going to sell yourself short in trying to understand that puzzle.
Right.
But I'm not trying to predict the outcome of a series of coin flips, right? Which would be this really implausible thing if I were to predict like the string of 12 straight coin flips. I'm looking back on 12 coin flips that have already happened, right? The plates already exist, and I'm trying to come up with what's the most likely explanation for their existence. Right. So that's kind of, I don't even remember what we were talking about at this point.
Yeah, no, that was a really good explanation. So maybe I can ask you a couple of questions, because I do want to bring up what the critics have said. You've addressed, what scholars have said about what they believe, how many plates there would have been, the thickness based on the dimensions for the plates. So I remember watching, this is probably like a year ago, watching like an LDS Discussions episode. I think we briefly touched on this off air last week. But I got this from his episode. He talks about the unsealed portion for the plates being 12 plates. Now, am I right in thinking he's saying that the Jaredite plates, there's 24 Jaredite plates, and he's assuming that that's 2/3 of the total plates? So he's saying that is 12 plates is the unsealed part. Is that where he's getting the number 12 from? Because I couldn't find a source where he's getting number 12 from. I don't know if he's getting it from a certain witness who said it.
There's no evidence from any of the witnesses that I've ever seen that limits the total number of plates to 12. I guess that could be the rationale if the 24
Jaredite plates is the sealed portion, and
Jaredite plates is the sealed portion
that say it's like 2/3, then I'm guessing that's me where he gets the 12 plates from.
I guess there's a I haven't
Is there
watched
any
this
problems?
video.
What would you say is problematic about the way he's gotten that number? If I finish his criticism, so he would divide, say, the 588 pages well, there's also the 116 lost pages, but let's just say for sake of argument, 588 pages divided by the 12 plates, he would say that that's what I think around 49 to 50 pages on a plate, which would be like over 20,000 words, and he would just say like, well, that's ridiculous, that's impossible, and math destroys the Book of Mormon. So what would be your response to him getting the 12 plates for the Book of Mormon?
So my first response would be that we don't, first of all, we don't have, I know lots of people like to say 2/3 of the plates were sealed. That's become like a really common thing, but the primary sources are murkier on that than our kind of historical consciousness about it, right? You have, I've finally found my slide here that talks about it, but you have primary sources that support anything from 1/3 to 1/2 to 2/3 being sealed.
Right.
Okay. And
so they're not very consistent.
They're not very consistent.
That's a bit of a range.
So even if you wanted to say 24 plates represents the sealed portion, okay, well, now what if the 24 plates are just 1/3? Well, now we have 2 times as many. So we have 48 plates to work with, right, for the unsealed portion. Or if it's 1/2, then we have at least 24 plates to work with. But the other problem with that is I don't think we can just assume that the 24 Jaredite plates represents what the sealed portion is. Yeah,
I don't think going to be my question. Like, how do we know that is the sealed portion? How do we know how large the 24 Jaredite plates were as well? Like, would they have been
exactly the Jaredite plates are, so far as I'm aware, and I've never seen anyone who's really seriously studied the plates who's proposed that the Jaredite plates are actually part of the set that Joseph Smith receives. The Jaredite plates are a source material for the Book of Ether, and that's it. That's all, and maybe for the sealed portion. But even if the sealed portion has material from the Jaredite plates, Moroni appears to have copied that over right onto his own set of plates. And so we don't know the size of the Jaredite plates and how that compares to Mormon's plates. We don't know if 24 plates means literally 24 individual plates, or if it's talking about like 24 sets of plates, which is what some people, I don't have any examples off the top of my head, but some people have suggested that's how we should read this reference to plates, because, you know, no one ever talks about any other record of plates that's already bound together as a set being a certain number of plates. They're, you know, a volume of plates is usually spoken of as a single entity. So some people have suggested it should be read as 24 volumes of plates, in which case we have no idea how many actual individual plates we're talking about here. Trying to kind of like take this, and I don't have any strong opinions on any of that stuff because it's not an area I personally researched, but trying to take this thing where we have a huge question mark of how what's said in the text here actually relates to the artifact the witnesses saw and handled and felt, and use that to kind of impose a limit on how many plates could have been there. That doesn't strike me as a very compelling way to come up with your total number of plates. I mean, it doesn't, there's way too many unknown question marks there as to what's really going on. I would be shocked if you could get a theory like that published in like a peer-reviewed place, like even like a dialogue, if a place that would potentially publish something like that. I would be really surprised if you could get something like that published there. I'll just say that.
Yeah, and one criticism I would have is just I wish he had have explained with a little bit more clarity where he was getting the number 12 from. I didn't find it apparent in the essay unless I missed it. But whenever I last looked over it, I couldn't see where he's getting this number 12 from for the plates, which I'm sort of having to guess how I think he might have gotten that number. So there was another criticism by, I don't know, did you watch the podcast with Dr. John Lundwall on Mormonish when he talks about the plates? I could get into his math because I think I wrote it down and just get your thoughts on it. Because he he talks about the plates being 6 inches in height or depth. Again, I think he addressed that there's some sources that support a third, a half, or 2/3 of it being sealed. So let's see. I think he goes with like let's just say for sake of argument, 3 inches unsealed, maybe 4 inches. How thins would the plates have to have been written on both sides? So this is where he would have, I think, disagree with what you were saying. These scholars, like Jerry Grover, said the plates could have been 1/10 of a millimeter, because in his analysis, he said like 1 millimeter in thickness. I don't think he went much below that in terms of thickness. I think if I'm representing him accurately, I think he would have said that anything thinner than that would have been too thin, and that the engravings would have went through to the other side, which Jerry would, go against.
Based on what though? Based on what premise does he come to that conclusion? Because, like I said, Jerry actually tested it. Like,
yeah.
Nobody I've seen on the critical side has been this hardcore. Okay, the dude went out and got metal sheets of certain thinness, right, copper, and then did a Tumbagga one, and he tested whether you could actually engrave on both sides, and he found that you could. Okay, so based on what? And I mean, you asked if I saw it. I did see that. I saw it like a week before I had to give this presentation. I'd already been working on all of this stuff on my own because I had like my own, like I said, I research stuff because I have questions about it. And I was not really impressed with Lundwall's how much he actually understood about ancient metal writing. He did not he did not sample a very wide breadth of all the examples out there.
Yeah, I thought that as well, compared to yourself, that you did a much more comprehensive.
It's not just, yeah, and like there's low-hanging fruit he should have known a lot more about. The Roman plates, I didn't even talk about the Roman plates here in this presentation, but like you have these Roman plates, right? He doesn't even mention these. These have been talked about by Latter-day Saints. John W. Welch does like a whole like 90-page paper on them in the John Sorensen Festschrift. You have these Roman diplomas that are, it's a 2 sets of plates. It's bound together by rings. They're written on both sides, and they generally come in about 1 millimeter, sometimes a little thinner than 1 millimeter thick. And he was saying he couldn't find examples like that. But, I already brought up the amulet that I talked about, not that one. This amulet that is 1/10 of a millimeter thick, and they wrote on both sides with it. It shows through. It does show through. It pushes through onto the other side, but maybe again, if they stained the text black, maybe they didn't care about that. Maybe ancient people were apparently willing to write on both sides of a document, even though the writing would push through to the other side, right, on a metal document.
So there's evidence of writing much thinner than what Lundwall is suggesting.
Yeah, I mean he sampled like, I don't know, a few dozen examples, and he made some pretty sweeping conclusions, I felt like, based on pretty limited knowledge. And again, he could have known more if he just would have read more Latter-day Saint scholarship on this stuff, because we've talked about, I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm talking about is new, but there was a lot of stuff he could have known more about if he just would have actually read more of the actual Latter-day Saint scholarship. I'm not sure how much he really dug into it, because he came across to me as having a pretty superficial knowledge, both of the Latter-day Saint arguments about it and of the actual ancient data. And I mean, I really don't want to get into a back and forth with John Lundwall on all of this stuff. I'm not that interested in having some kind of protracted debate or whatever, but I was pretty underwhelmed by what he brought to the table as far as that goes.
I remember in my discussion with Brandt, Brandt also felt that it was too simplistic when we had our sort of response interview, when he was talking about like their sort of like oral culture, and then like secondary oral, and then literate, and that the Maya Mesoamericans, they were oral or secondary oral, but they weren't literate, and he very much had it just bracketed, like separated. And Brant was saying that he's making the lines too rigid, that the ancient Mayan, they were both literate and oral, and it was just a lot more complex than the way he was suggesting, particularly with, like, say, ancient writings like the Popol Vuh, for example, being a mixture of both. And that was sort of like, that kind of opened my eyes a little bit. And maybe with this, because I think I have this written down. I think he worked out, he said there's 24 jaredite plates. Moroni says he could write about 100th part, which again, does Moroni mean literally 1 out of 100, like dividing it by 100? So he then calculated the Book of Ether is 100th part of the 24 jaredite plates. Then, assuming that the gold plates are the same size as the jaredite plates, that the 30 pages of ether would have been contained on 1/4 of a plate. And I don't know what, I can't actually remember what he said was the number of plates for the entire Book of Mormon. I think that's how he calculated it. Your thoughts on that method to calculate?
Yeah,
Because
I mean,
obviously, to most people watching, they would be like, "Well, that just sounds absurd and ridiculous." And this is, of course, Joe Smith making it up. Your thoughts on him working out that number?
yeah. So there's a lot. There's a lot to say about it. A lot of it is the same stuff I already said. There's questions we don't know. We don't actually know the size of the jaredite plates. So when he comes in and wants to say, well, they're the same size as the Book of Mormon plates, we have no idea. And there's absolutely no inherent reason to assume that Ether, making plates for the Jaredites, would have used what appears to be the standard plate size for Nephites, right? You can't, there's no argument to even be made. We can only speculate on what size those were. There's absolutely no data to work with on that. So you don't know. I mean, these could have been really large plates for all we know. And I think, again, you would be surprised if you have larger sized plates. Sometimes you might be surprised. I talked about the Inguvine tablets where there's only 7 tablets. And even knowing how much larger those tablets are, I didn't think they would come out to 60 or 61 or whatever it was, Book of Mormon sized plates. But when you do the math on the surface area, you'd be surprised at like how much more surface area you get when you enlarge plates by just a little bit. So, who's to say these weren't larger plates that were like the Inguvine plates, and they were like 16 by 33 inches or something like that. And there were 24 like that. Like, we don't know. And
that's true,
again,
yeah.
we don't even know if it's 24 individual plates or if it's like 24 books of plates.
We're making a lot of assumptions.
There's just a lot of assumptions you have to make before you start doing the math to say this is what it tells us about the artifact the witnesses described. We can't draw any lines there. And the 100th part, I mean, I feel like anyone who has an elementary understanding of the English language, and if I remember correctly, I think John Lundwall's degree at BYU was in English, so he should have a pretty good grasp of the English language, I assume.
That's more of a matter of speech. We can
That's
only
an idiom. It's an idiom. It's an idiomatic expression. You don't need to know ancient languages to understand that. It's an idiomatic expression. We don't know how literal that is. They're just telling us, hey, there's a lot we can't put into our record. There's a lot that won't fit. We're trying to abridge. We're trying to be concise. There are other people who have argued that the Book of Ether is probably about the size of what the actual Jaredite record was, because you have portions that are the abridged record of Ether from Moroni, and then you have these other portions that are Moroni adding his own material and commentary inserted in between. And
I think it isn't Ether chapter 12. I think that's a chapter on
that whole chapter is Moroni.
About faith. Yeah. And that's Moroni. That's not from.
And you have like, there are multiple junctures in the text where Moroni inserts this long portion, and you can actually excise Moroni's portions, and the text stitches together perfectly. Some people have made like a source critical argument here, right? That we must have 2 authors, the original record of Ether, and then you have Moroni, because when you pull out Moroni's interjections, sometimes very long interjections, the narrative actually stitches together smoothly. And so some people have
Interesting.
argued that the Jaredite record may not have been much longer than what we actually have in the Book of Ether. There may have been some chunks that he cut out or something like that, but that's made up for with the extra material Moroni himself adds. We don't know. That's all just guesswork, right? We can't know for sure whether that's true.
And is there any source or anything that would indicate that the 24 Jaredite plates, like we touched on this earlier, but that makes up the sealed portion, or is there anything that supports that, or is that just
I
sort of
mean, there might
speculation?
be, if you look long enough and hard enough, you might be able to find like some early church leader in the Journal of Discourses or something saying that, right? But
Like you're reading through the text.
there's no eyewitness description of that, and even the eyewitnesses wouldn't know what's in the sealed portion. That's the whole point. It's sealed, right?
Oh, sure.
There's no revelation, right? There's no canonized revelation that says that's what it is, and there's nothing in the text, as far as I'm aware of, that says that's what it is. Or whether Moroni abridged what was on the 24 Jaredite plates into the sealed portion or whatever, right? So again, I might be wrong. I'm speaking off the top of my head here because I haven't specifically researched that issue, but
Yeah, me neither.
I mean, we do know, like, there's the what there is in Ether. There's, I think, Ether 2 or 3. You have the brother of Jared seeing the vision of Christ, and he's given an elaborate revelation of the end times or whatever, right? Of everything from creation to the end or whatever.
Yes, I think so, yeah.
And he is supposed to write that down and seal it up. And that might constitute part of what Moroni like abridges onto the sealed portion or something like that. But we never have Moroni, as far as I'm aware of, never have Moroni saying, this is the portion that I've sealed and put into the sealed portion of this book or anything like that, right? And so when you're trying to draw conclusions about what is the sealed portion of this specific document, I don't know that we have any source material that tells us what that is.
Right.
So
Gotcha. So the characters they were described by the witnesses as being, small, the word fine engravings on it.
Yeah.
Could you go back to that slide, one with the different scholars saying the number of plates most likely? Yeah. So yeah, different scholars. So Putman saying, if they 6 inches in depth, 120 plates. Perhaps Robert Smith, 120 to 200, Jerry Grover, 300 to 600, because he has the thickness quite thin from his testing. And if it was in that range, then that makes it a lot more plausible, definitely a lot different to what the critics are saying, that this is the number of plates there only could have been. Hello, everyone. So this ends my part 2 discussion with Neal Rappleye on ancient metal plates in the ancient world, and talking about the dimensions and the descriptions of the gold plates, responding to critics and their attacks on the gold plates. We did continue talking about Reformed Egyptian and the characters document, but I thought I could divide that into a third episode because it's about like another hour, and this is quite a long episode. So there's one more part. It's going to be about 1 hour, and we're going to have a really good discussion on, is there such a thing as Reformed Egyptian? Was there Egyptian influence in Israel at the time of Lehi and his family? And then we have a look at the characters document, and does it bear any resemblance to ancient Egyptian characters or Reformed Egyptian scripts? So check out part 3. And I think this has been a really great episode. I think the scholarship and the research he's done has been really amazing. And I think as well that people need to try to share and try to promote some of this work that's being done, share these episodes, because for me, I think this is one of the most interesting episodes and interviews that I've had. So really do try to share it as well. And apologies for my camera and mic being really bad. There's been a lot of technical issues since I've moved into a new place and installing things. So I'm hoping I can get that resolved. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.